On today's show, it's officially been 10 years that Sean Marks has been Nets general manager, and despite the team's lack of playoff success, he isn't going anywhere. Why is that the case, and is it the right decision? I'll answer that on today's episode of Locked On Nets.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to Locked On Nets right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Now the number one sports podcast network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. Thank you for making me your first listen of the day. The show is 100% free on all those great platforms. And on today's episode, I got Brian Lewis of the New York Post coming on the show to talk about Sean Marks. Brian just wrote a piece about Sean Marks' 10-year anniversary as general manager of the Nets. We'll get into Sean's tenure, what's gone right, what's gone wrong, why he looks like he's likely to stick around, and whether or not we feel that's the right decision. Let's go. Joining the show now, we got Brian Lewis of the New York Post. And Brian, we're here today to talk about Sean Marks because you just wrote an article, and tomorrow will mark 10 years that Sean Marks has been general manager of the Brooklyn Nets. You have been here on the beat for all 10 of those years, and we all know that it's featured a lot of ups, a lot of downs. You know, Sean, despite being here for a decade, which is extremely long for a GM of any team, let alone a New York team, he only has one playoff series win during that span. Obviously, that's the stat that always gets brought back to, and yet, by all accounts, his job status seems fairly secure right now, and it appears that he is going to be here for the long haul, or at least the medium haul. And that is my takeaway based on how the Nets have been operating, the things that I've heard just talking around the organization and around the league. It seems like Sean is going to be here. On this episode, we're going to nail down on the reasons for that and answer whether we think he's the right guy for the job, analyze his strengths, his weaknesses, his overall tenure. But first, I have the takeaway. I feel like Sean's going to be here for an extended period. Do you have that same viewpoint on what his job security is at the moment?
I presume that he will. Listen, I'm never going. There's only one opinion that matters on that, and that's Joe Tsai's opinion. And Joe has not been shy or reticent about replacing people that he felt were underachieving in important roles, like head of BSE. I mean, he was going through one a year for a while. But everything that I've heard from multiple sources is that Sean is completely safe. The two of them are in lockstep. They talk frequently. They have open conversations and open dialogue. And everything that I've heard is that Sean is safe and would be here for a while.
And that will come as a surprise to some people who, just look at the overall track record of success in terms of playoff runs and things along those lines. But if you look at how they've been operating, the fact that they came out of the Big Three era and they were, you could say, at a crossroads organizationally, and Sean was entrusted to move forward, to make drafts, made an NBA record 5 first-round picks in the last draft. He's operating this season, heading for another top pick. If you entrust somebody to do that, whether or not you agree with it, it shouldn't be that surprising that that person is going to be here for an extended period beyond this, because you're not just going to let someone, go into a rebuild, start, in the infancy of that rebuild, and then fire them right away. It just doesn't make sense. It's not a way that you typically would operate. Now, do I think that Sean will have to show some results in the medium term? Yes, but that's still an extended period. And I want to talk about his overall tenure, because you've been here for it all. And to some people, they might be not surprised that Sean is still here and going to be here. They might be happy about it. And then some people might think that it's just lunacy, because this GM, as I said, one playoff series win in a decade. You don't see GMs usually stick around through that, let alone in the New York market. And I would say with Sean, though, the thing that I've always come back to is that there are some extenuating circumstances into how the team that he built that had a legitimate chance or was a title favorite unraveled, obviously, with the COVID-19 pandemic and all of that. But when I look at Sean, I look at a guy who inherited a team that was in one of the worst situations in sports history, really, in terms of the roster, in terms of their cap health, in terms of their assets, young players, and draft picks. And obviously he was able, through a lot of savvy moves, to build that up to the point where it was a title contender. It didn't work out. But then I kind of look at how he's parlayed that and kind of spun out of that. And I feel like he's gotten the Nets to another point where they're healthy. And I think if you're the fan of the team, you feel pretty good about where they're at in their future in terms of the assets that they've had, the draft class they just had come in, and just the overall health of the organization. So that's kind of my viewpoint on it, and that's why I think that he's still here. But when you assess his overall tenure, what is your opinion, and what would you say to people who think that it's a little ridiculous that he's still here?
Well, like, as I said, I mean, the opinion that matters, or mattered before, was Mikhail Prokhorov's. The opinion that matters now is Joe Tsai. Both of them have faith in Sean. Sean has done a good job in terms of building relationships with both of them. I would agree with you. It shouldn't be that shocking, because if you're going to entrust whomever, and in this case, Sean Marks, with starting this rebuild, and by that, I mean, he's making the trade once you are getting rid of Kevin Durant, right? Once Kevin comes in and demands out, you had not just one, but two opportunities to pivot. You could have broken it down right then and there and started from scratch once you traded Kevin Durant. Some would argue that might have been the wiser course of action, but Joe Tsai was very clear. He was not interested at that point in tearing it down and burning it down and starting from scratch. He wanted to try to contend. Did not feel at that point that it was wise or even feasible to tank in New York. You can argue that all you want, but that was his standpoint at that time. Then your second opportunity to pivot comes when you're deciding to move off of Mikhail, right? And now you are genuinely tanking and burning it down and rebuilding it from scratch. Sean was entrusted at both of those opportunities, right? So at this point, really, you shouldn't be shocked. If you're paying attention, you really shouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
Now you can argue the quality of the job he's done. Maybe you think he's done a good job. Maybe you think he's done a poor job. But just in terms of whether you should be shocked that he's here, no.
Yeah, when you take a step back, I mean, you've been here for it all. You've been through, the beginning of his tenure, the craziness that ensued with the big three, and now how they've kind of parlayed it into this new situation where it seems like they're finally going to build through the draft for the first time in God knows how long. But when you take a step back and you kind of assess the overall job that Sean has done and kind of everything that went into it, because it isn't just as black and white as one playoff series win. Like, sure, the results are a big thing and you can't disregard them, but you saw firsthand the situation that he inherited and the situation he was able to build it up into, and then how it all kind of came crashing down. And that, I think, sequence that illustrated a lot of his strengths, a lot of his weaknesses. We're going to get into both of those in the second segment. But what is your takeaway when you kind of just assess his rise and then the fall and the point where he's been able to put the Nets into now?
I mean, I think overall, the body of work is probably more positive than negative. I think Sean has, I think there are aspects of it that he's better at than others. Okay. I also think we need to say just the same way the roster's changed, and is turned over several times. Frankly, so has the front office. I get it that Sean has been here, but there has been, for lack of a better term, a brain drain in Brooklyn. He's had to replace a lot of guys that have gone on and left.
And wouldn't you say that's not necessarily fully, a feather in his cap, but it's a sign that people around the league look at how the Nets have operated and they look at some of the things that they've been able to do and said, we like some of the ways that they've, been going about things, and we're willing to take people who have been in that front office who have then elevated to major leadership positions with other teams. But go on. But I think that does say a little bit something about how the organization is viewed around the league.
I do. And with any organization, when you lose talent, if you lose talent to Detroit, you lose talent to Charlotte, right? You have to replace said talent. So yes, I think that both things are true. One, it's, if you want to call it a feather in his cap. Two, it's a challenge to replace those people, right? And as far as overall, I think he's done a better job drafting probably than he gets credit for, because I hear people say, well, he has drafted an all-star. Well, technically he did. He drafted Jared Allen. But, well, he's been here 10 years. Where's the superstar, or where's the MVP caliber player, or what have you? If you take a look at where he was drafting, it's hard to find all-stars drafting 27th, 28th, 26th, 25th. It can be done, but it's hard. It's a lot easier to find those players drafting third or fourth, which I'm sure probably we'll get back around to that. I know you'll want to talk about that. I think he has been patient to a fault in terms of the trades. He wants to win them all and wants to hit a home run on all of them. Now, there are opportunities that he's had that maybe he kept the player too long. They turned down 2 first-round draft picks for Dorian Finney-Smith. That's a decision. But again, as I said, the mandate at that point was to try to compete and try to win games. And I think you probably know as well as anybody, take a look at his on-off splits and his plus minuses. Is he the flashiest player in the world? No, but he sure as hell helped them compete. So that was the mandate at that point. On the flip side, you see he held Mikal Bridges beyond where some would have initially said, oh, you have to trade him, get the number 3 pick, get Scoot, do this, do that. He decided, I'm going to hold this player, and you see what the return was. So he's been patient to a fault. More often than not, that's ended up being to his benefit. We will see with Michael Porter Jr., because Michael Porter Jr. fits that same category. They did not engage seriously on any conversations with Michael Porter Jr. None.
Yeah.
Not one. Now, if they end up not extending him, if they end up trading him in the summer, and the return isn't great, then again, you can argue, you'll see, well, was that a right decision? Was it the wrong decision? We'll see. But it is in keeping with how he seems to do his business. And more often than not, he's been rewarded for it.
Yeah, the trades
where I think he has not performed that well was in picking of coaches.
Yes.
Now, if you want to say 2 of 4, that's a good percentage on 3-pointers. Yeah, that's great. But 2 of 4, if that's your final exam,
not so good. Yeah, so and we're gonna get into that. I want to talk about, you just touched on it a little bit, but I want to get into deciding, whether or not we think Sean is the right guy for the job. I want to talk about his strengths. I want to talk about his weaknesses in a lot of the different areas that have gone into running this Nets franchise over the last decade. So we'll talk about all that when we continue Locked On Nets after a quick break. Guys, ever wanted to experience the NBA Finals live and in person? FanDuel is giving you the chance to turn that dream into a reality with their NBA sweepstakes. Here's how it works. Use your profit boost on any NBA future, and you'll automatically be entered for a shot to win an NBA Finals trip for 2. That's right, flights, tickets, the whole experience. If you're already looking at the NBA standings and thinking about which team can make a deep run, this is the perfect time to lock in. You'll love futures this time of year. Whether it's picking a team to win the championship or grab a conference title, it adds that extra layer of excitement to every game down the stretch. And now, not only can your pick cash, but it can also send you to the finals. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. To use your profit boost on an NBA future and get entered for your chance to win a trip to the NBA Finals. Play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Guys, new year, new systems. This is the time when a lot of us look at the messier parts of how we run our business and think there has to be a better way. And there is. Streamlining your communications is one of the quickest upgrades you can make. That's why today's episode is brought to you by Quo, spelled Quo, the smarter way to run your business communications. Because when your team is reachable, organized, and communicating in one place, you're not just working cleaner, you're creating more opportunities to connect with customers. Guys, I love how simple Quo makes everything. Your whole team can call and text them from one shared business number, so nothing gets missed. Everyone sees the full conversation thread, which makes replies faster and more personal. And it works right from your phone or computer. You can even keep your existing number. It's no surprise Quo is the #1 rated business phone system on G2, trusted by more than 90,000 businesses, from solo operators to growing teams. Make this the year where no opportunity and no customer slips away. Try Quo for free plus 20% off your first 6 months when you go to quo.com/LockedOnNBA. That's QUO.com/LockedOnNBA. Quo. No missed calls, no missed customers. All right, coming back from the break, talking with Brian Lewis here on Locked On Nets about Sean Marks and how the Nets are going to move forward with him as general manager, whether we feel, that's the right decision, and what we think about Sean's strengths and weaknesses as someone who is leading this Nets organization. And I want to talk about Sean's strengths first, because I do think that there are a few, and you kind of touched on him before that. But first, obviously, I think a lot of these strengths were on display with the way that he built this team up after he took over in 2016, a team that had no draft capital, very little, if any, young talent, and was not in a good position really financially. And he was able to kind of get healthy in a lot of those different areas and build it up to a point through salary dumps, through moving off veterans at the right times, through buy low, trades, through talent identification in the G League. He built up a roster that was attractive enough to land stars like Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and then James Harden. Obviously, that didn't work out. We'll get into that in the weaknesses, but I think that shows some strengths in terms of the trade and salary cap management, roster and salary cap management, the trades, which you just touched on. And I want to get in a little bit more, like you talked about Sean holding some guys and how that has sometimes worked out, sometimes not worked out. I think if you look at the recent sample size and you look at the big moves, like Dorian Finney-Smith, yes, like they could have gotten 2 first-round picks, what protections from who, we don't know, but that seems like a misstep. But then you look at trades that have been unequivocally much bigger and more important, like the last 3 trades, the KD trade, the Mikal Bridges trade, and then the Cam Johns for Michael Porter Jr. trade. Those were home run trades, in my opinion. Like all 3 of those, the KD trade has, grown into an astronomical haul that looks better as more trades come in and you see what some other teams are getting for star players who are younger than Kevin Durant was when the Nets made that trade. That looks good. And then this recent Michael Porter Jr. trade, obviously there were, split opinions amongst it, but he got very good value for Cam Johnson. And it seems like they're going to be able to flip Michael Porter Jr. for even more assets and grow that KD trade tree. So overall, the trades, I think that you got to come away like pretty encouraged by what he's been able to do as of late.
Oh, I would agree with that assessment. As I said, I think I have to look at each trade on its value. I think his tendency, right, is to hold a guy until he gets the price that he wants. Generally speaking, that price is pretty high. And if he doesn't get the price that he wants, then he just, doesn't trade him. Clearly, the KD trade is more important than a Dorian Finney-Smith trade. That's more vital, right, to the health of your organization, to getting that right. And that was a home run. The Mikal Bridges trade, I think anybody can acknowledge from the Nets' perspective, was a home run. If the Knicks win, then it's a home run for them too. But certainly from the Nets' perspective, was a home run. And yes, MPJ, as the season has worn on and as he clearly rehabilitated his value, you can't say that was anything but a win for Brooklyn. As far as the trades, yes, I would say that might be his biggest strength. I think the drafting has, for the most part, been solid. There have been misses.
Yeah, and let's
a miss.
let's get into the drafting, because I think that that's also been a strength of Sean Marks. And then BJ Johnson, all the people that he's brought in to run that scouting department, I think that they've done a very good job. You look at just the numbers, and for some reason, like some fans have this opinion, it seems like that maybe they haven't drafted well. Like you said, they haven't gotten that all-star level player. And I feel like fans have not the best grasp on what the hit rate is for picks that are from 20 to 31. You overwhelmingly do not hit on those picks usually. And if you look at the Nets, before this year, they have made 8 first-round picks during Sean's tenure, the highest of which was 20 and the lowest of which was 31, if we include Nick Claxton, who was the first pick of the second round. So I'll include that. Out of those 8 picks, Jared Allen, Karis LeVert, Jean Musa, Nick Claxton, Cam Thomas, Day'Ron Sharpe, Noah Clowney, Dariq Whitehead. I'd say 6 of those 8 are hits, given where they were selected. I mean, you can quibble about Cam Thomas. Obviously didn't work out here, but I definitely think that he's an NBA talent. I think that he'll be in the league for a while. Noah Clowney, to be determined, but has looked really encouraging in spurts this season. The only true misses, I would say, are Musa and Whitehead. And picks 20 to 31, hitting on 4, 5, 6, however you want to grade some of those swing guys out of 8, that's elite drafting. And look, none of them have popped into like star level players, but at the points where he's been drafting, that's very good relative to what the average hit rate is on picks in that range.
I think that's probably, I don't disagree with you. I think that's probably just symptomatic of the larger sports discourse, right? That everything is either fantastic or it's terrible, right? Either a guy is going to float into the Hall of Fame on a cloud or he's trash. And there's nothing in between and there's no gray area. I think it's largely misunderstood, right? When you say, example, first round draft pick, well, not all first round picks are created equal, right? Picking 28th is not the same as picking 4th. It just isn't. And the hit rate the hit rate for guys in the second round is basically non-existent. Again, 31 is not the same as picking 57, but anything that you get out of the second round is a success. So yeah, I think it's probably safe to say where he's been drafting, his hit rate has been better than average.
Yeah,
and again, that's churning and turning over the front office. It's not all the same guys that have been involved in this. You have guys that were in charge of the draft or were heads of scouting that are now either GMs or assistant GMs elsewhere. Matt in Dallas was one of Spencer Dinwiddie's biggest proponents, right? You've got, GM in Detroit. Now, granted, he didn't put the Pistons in first place. He inherited a pretty damn good team, but they came off of this staff. Same thing in Charlotte, right? So he's had to replace a lot of guys, which by definition means you don't know how they're going to draft in the future. You have to wait and you have to see. But for the most part, I would agree with your premise. I think over the last decade, they've drafted well and hit at an above average clip.
Yeah, and then that's not even bringing into account this draft, which obviously, a lot of people made fun of, but Yegor looking very encouraging right now, and we'll see on the rest of the guys. But overall, I think when you look at the trades in the draft, which I'd say that both of those he's done pretty well in, and then you add in the aspect of how you're managing the salary cap, how you're kind of navigating around these different rules as the CBA has been changing. I would just say, like, if you look at the tasks that Sean Marks has had, he came in and he was tasked with building the team, rebuilding the team to a point where it was competitive. I think he more than did that. Now the final process of seeing it through to a championship team, he fell short there. And then you look at after that, rebuilding it into a situation where the team was in a good position again. That I think he's done a good job out of. So he's come up, good in some areas. He's, kind of missed the mark on some others. And I want to talk about some of the weaknesses. And I think that the weaknesses really showed in the point where the Nets got to that championship level and they were trying to build forward. And I'd say that, managing star personalities, I think that was an issue for this team. Now, managing Kyrie Irving and James Harden and Kevin Durant somewhat at that point in their career, no, easy task. I would say that, but he came up short in that regard. And I'd say a big part of that was the coaches, which is something that you talked about in your article. Hiring Steve Nash and then hiring Jacques Vaughn, guys who were just not equipped to handle the personalities in that locker room. That to me is the biggest, kind of black mark on Sean's tenure thus far, and really was a, big part of, them kind of not being able to see that big three era out and get it to work out, for longer than it did, which was ultimately only like 14 games that those guys played together.
Yeah, listen, Kevin Durant had a pre-existing relationship with Steve Nash. They worked out in the off seasons, and I get that. I understand that. But let's be fair. That was Sean's hire. Sean and Steve were friends, and Sean had been trying to get Steve in the building repeatedly for other jobs, and he kept upping the ante and offering better job, and Steve kept saying no, until finally the job was the head coaching job, and he was so good he couldn't turn it down. That was ill-advised. Now, I happen to think Kenny Atkinson is a damn good coach. Is he the greatest coach in the NBA? No, but he's a damn good coach. And they fired him. Not, whatever. We can say mutual. They fired him.
Why'd they fire him?
I mean, it's pretty obvious that if the star players wanted him here, he would have been here. All right?
That's a big part of the conversation, in my opinion.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, again, I'm not telling you that Kenny is Spo, right? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying when LeBron wanted Spo gone, Pat said, no, that's not happening. Make it work. They probably would have been better suited in Brooklyn had they done that, but they didn't. Steve Nash, that was a mistake. Jacques Vaughn, as much as I love Jacques, and I really like Jacques is a good Class A dude. And he was a loyal assistant and good and useful at it too. He was helpful. But as a head coach, it just didn't work.
Yeah, and I need to interject and also say that, those are mistakes on Sean's part. Would he have stuck with Kenny, through everything if the stars hadn't come in and said, kind of that they wanted to change? I can't say that for sure. But they hired a coach in Kenny Atkinson who was a good coach. They're firing him. You can say maybe they should have put their foot down and said, KD, Kyrie, we're not firing this guy. You guys got to make it work. He didn't do that. Like, they came, obviously, those players under certain pretenses. And then once they were looking for the next coach, they effectively had hired Ime Udoka. And then the NBA stepped in and kind of said, like, no, this guy needs to sit out the year. He needs to, pay his penance. And they end up not coming away with Udoka, and they end up hiring Jacques Vaughn. Again, you can say hiring Jacques Vaughn from interim to the regular head coach a mistake, but they did want Udoka. And if they had their druthers, they would have gotten him, and that would have been perceived as a good hire. So the coaching thing, I think, is the biggest black mark on Sean. But I do think that there are some, areas where he kind of didn't get his druthers. And you can say that that's his fault for not being assertive enough, but I feel like it must be mentioned.
Yes. And Kevin actually was a big proponent of Ime. It would have been fascinating to see how that would have worked out with Ime. Any good coach, frankly. There were a number of coaches that I think probably would have led to keeping that together longer. And the irony is, now when you're tanking, now granted, it's early days, you're a year and a half in, but by all accounts, Jordy's a good coach. Jordy is well respected around the league, and people that have forgotten more basketball than I'll ever know say he's doing and has done a good job, and probably will continue to do a good job and do an even better job. Right? So 2 for 4. The irony is when you're trying to win, that's when you had the 2 worst coaches.
Yeah. And I think that as I said, I think part of that had to do with kind of how they landed on Kenny's dismissal, and then kind of how Jock's hiring, kind of how that played out with some NBA involvement. I think all that played into it. Another weakness, like if we're talking about the way that things kind of played out after the end of the Big Three era, like I gave Sean his praise for some of the trades that he's been able to pull off. The James Harden for Ben Simmons trade was a disastrous trade in retrospect. Now you can say like James was going to be a free agent at the end of that season. He had signaled that he wanted to leave. Were you really going to risk losing him for nothing? All these fans that talk tough and act like they would have just, let it ride and held on to him. If you were in that situation, I don't know if you would have done that. But going from James and getting, 2 late first-round picks, what it seems like they're going to be, and saddling yourself with that Simmons contract, which effectively handicapped the team for like 3 seasons, that was a bad deal. And I think that was a major misstep, in conjunction with some of the, head coaching issues and things that they had during that Star tenure.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. And it's probably a horrible analogy. I'm just not bright enough to come up with a good one. But it's like getting into a car accident and you're driving without insurance, right? Well, what's the worst mistake? I don't know. Is the worst mistake maybe you were a little careless behind the wheel, or is the worst mistake you're careless in your life and you don't have insurance? I don't know. But that's essentially what happened with Harden, right? Because I get it. By all definition, that was a horrible trade, right? By any definition. Some people might even contend that trading for James was a bad decision. But I will tell you that Sean has the utmost respect for James's basketball IQ. He thinks he's a genius.
Yeah,
he thinks he's an absolute genius.
They were a bona fide title favorite for, going into that playoff thing, and it didn't work out. COVID, I think, played a massive role in that. But look, I go back, I do that Harden trade 10 times out of 10.
Again, I'm just acknowledging that some people would debate that. But by any definition, the James Harden, Ben Simmons deal was horrid. However, my question that I would put to you is, if James Harden is running around the league telling people in the league, telling other players, this is not working, I'm not feeling it, I want out. And if he's telling other players this, enough players that now reporters are starting to hear it, you cannot get broadsided by that.
Yeah.
48 hours before the trade deadline. That is when Sean calls Joe Tsai and says, I think we have a problem. And James is essentially ghosting them. And then Joe has to call James and wrangle out of him the truth, rather than James just being direct and saying, I want out, which he could have said a week earlier, 2 weeks earlier, 3 weeks earlier.
He said it. I mean, what I don't understand is he said it on the court about as loud as you could during that game against Sacramento.
Yes, but then denied it later to them.
Yeah, I mean, it's James's fault, but like, it doesn't take a rocket scientist and ownership.
I'm not even assessing. Whatever James does is whatever James does.
No, I'm saying it doesn't take a rocket scientist at the ownership or the front office level to see that game and say, all right, we got some serious problems.
That's my point. You can't get broadsided to the point where now you're having to hustle and scramble and run and get the best deal possible, right? That's, to me, every bit as egregious as the failing in terms of the actual trade. The process that led to you being hurried and harried into a bad trade. But maybe, some people might look at that and say, you're picking nits. What's the point? It was a bad trade.
So. I don't think so at all. I think that's totally fair. And I think that those two things work in conjunction. And I think that, that's another thing. And in addition to the head coaches, although, as I said, there were some factors that, were somewhat out of Sean's control in that regard. That trade was a huge deal because that, better than anybody, like that led to, Kyrie obviously wanted out. And then, KD's looking around saying, I got Kyrie's leaving. We got another star who's eating $40 million of our cap sheet and doesn't play. Get me out of here. And that was the ultimate demise of the whole thing. So overall strengths, weaknesses, I think you see the strengths, like a lot of good trades. Drafting, I think, has been a strength overall. They're managing personalities, hiring coaches. Some of that have been weaknesses, but overall, they've been able to spin this out to a point where I feel like they're pretty cap healthy or very cap healthy.
Very cap healthy.
They have the most assets in the league. They have some promising young pieces, although not any at like the highest level. And they have a head coach who is very highly regarded around the NBA. So all of that should have you feeling pretty good. And that's why I feel like Sean is going to be here and Joe has trust in him. How do they build forward from here? What are Sean's next steps? What's going to play a big role in whether or not he's here for the actual long haul? We'll get into all that when we close out Locked On Nets after a quick break. Workplace chaos, deadlines stacking up, inbox overflowing, and the one position you have to fill still sitting open. When the pressure's on and you need the right hire, that's a job for Sponsored Jobs. Indeed Sponsored Jobs help you reach people who actually fit what you're looking for. Skills, experience, location. So you're not just hoping the right candidates stumble across your post. And here's a stat that says it all. In the minute I've been talking to you, companies like yours have made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Less stress, less time, more results. When you need the right person to cut through the chaos, that's a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to help get your job the premium status it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? That's a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. All right, coming back from the break with Brian Lewis here on today's Locked On Nets episode. Closing it out, talking about Sean Marks. How does he build forward now with this team? What is going to lead to him potentially having the most long-term job security? And, I think regardless of how things go in May, I think that Sean can build this out forward successfully. But the ironic part about it is some ping pong balls flying around in a plastic machine in May are going to play a massive role in his ability to really build this out somewhat, fast, not fast in terms of like next season, but in the next few years to the point where they have a chance to be a legitimate contender. And that cannot be understated. Like if they fall outside of the top 4 or 5, can Sean still move this forward successfully? Sure. But getting the number 1 or number 2 or number 3 pick in the draft, that's going to play a huge role and how they kind of move forward with this. So, to me, that's going to be really fascinating to see. But overall, like when you assess the overall position they're in, how do you feel like Sean is going to be able to build this forward? And do you feel like they're in a position where if you were a Nets fan, you would feel good about him being at the helm?
I would feel good about it because, as one general manager pointed out to me, he says, listen, is he the perfect general manager? No, but I think he's better than what you're liable to get as your replacement. I think you're in better hands with him than you would be with whoever you would replace him with. That's the first thing. Second, listen, their roster at the beginning of this season, kind of talent poor, certainly, but where I would expect their roster to be by the end of next season is at an entirely different place and level than where it was at the beginning of this past season, where you had several 19-year-olds who might have had talent and potential were not ready to play in the NBA, where you had some placeholders in your lineup, and where you did not have that one foundational piece that you're building around, at least certainly that young foundational piece that you're building around, and you certainly didn't have an established star, anybody who has all-stars under his belt, you should have flipped that by the end of next year. Right now, I don't know where they're going to draft. I don't know who they're going to get. I don't know whether it's Peterson or Boozer, or they could be drafting 7th or 8th. I don't know. And you're absolutely right. Luck plays a huge role in this. Huge. Just ask the Mavericks, right? Luck plays a pretty damn big role in this. But I'm going to assume that while they might not be shameless in their tanking, I expect that they'll be aggressive in their tanking, right? So if you can end up in the top 3 and think that you'll probably draft whatever, 6th, 7th, you'll still get a good player.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a major thing that must be said. Like, this draft in the top 10, I've just started looking into some of the guys these last few weeks and talking to draft people. This draft's deeper in the top 10 than last year's was. And last year's draft was very highly regarded. So look, that top 4 separated itself with, Peterson, DeBansta, Boozer, Wilson. If the Nets land any of those guys, especially Peterson, they're looking very good. Beyond that, though, you have some prospects.
If they get Boozer, no, seriously.
I agree. I'm saying it, but even beyond that, if you go into the 5-6 range, some Nets fans last year were like, you think that might be a disaster? Look, I'm still saying it'd be very disappointing, but there are some really good players in that range this year. So overall, closing it out, I feel like if the Nets do actually get some luck for, the first time in however long, it seems like they never have any luck go their way. If they are able to land a Peterson or a Boozer or a DeBansta or one of those guys, they're looking great, even some of the guys beyond that. But if you have that main foundational piece, you have Yegor and some of these other guys that are starting to look okay. You have MPJ, whether you decide to keep him or parlay him into other things. With the amount of cap space and the amount of assets that they have from a draft pick perspective moving forward, I'd feel good. Like I said, Sean's biggest strengths, he's done overall with his biggest trades, for the most part, he's done really well. I'd say 3 for 4. The draft picks, I laid out the track record. That looks good. He's been able to manipulate the salary cap. All that stuff in conjunction, if I were a Nets fan, I'd feel pretty good about the position the Nets are in moving forward. And obviously, that result in May will play a big factor in that. But Brian, appreciate taking the time. If you guys don't already, go check out all of Brian's stuff in the New York Post. Go check out his article on Sean Marks from the other day, which was great. But we got a lot more storylines during the second half of the season, and we'll circle back for sure and try to have you back on. But appreciate taking the time, man. That does it for today's episode of Locked On Nets. Hope you guys enjoyed the talk with Brian. If you do not already, make sure to subscribe to Locked On Nets on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, whether Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you enjoy my show, take a second right now, smash that like button, leave a comment, leave a 5-star review. Anything you can do to engage is much appreciated. But that's got one more day off, and they're back in action on Thursday. So I've covered you all that and more when I'm back tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.